Welcome back to the Nature for Life Hub. Yesterday, we discussed the role of finance in either advancing or reversing biodiversity loss. Today, we examine the role of government in policy making, planning, budgeting, and implementation. Because even the most well-funded vision remains just an idea without the scaffolding of effective policy and the hard work of effective practice. Policy is where ambition is written down. Practice is where it's tested. And it's in the space between the two, between the plan and the outcome, that so many of our best intentions falter. Today, we'll explore this critical gap by focusing on three core challenges. First, we'll examine the policy itself, the national biodiversity strategies that serve as a country's official roadmap. We'll ask how to forge these plans into dynamic, inclusive blueprints for genuine action, and how they can inform and influence national development to build prosperity that works with and for nature. From the plan, we turn to the practice on the ground. We will look at two key strategies, not as siloed environmental topics, but as core pillars of national development. We will examine how protecting a nation's natural capital can be an engine for economic growth and community well-being. And we will explore how restoring our productive landscapes is one of the most direct pathways to creating jobs and building resilience. We begin with the primary way that nations express their commitment to nature, the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans, otherwise known as NBSAPs. NBSAPs explain how a country intends to implement the global biodiversity framework. But persistent gaps between ambition and results have given rise to skepticism among many. And in many cases, NBSAPs fail to influence and inform other policies and plans at national and sectoral level, despite our wide reliance on nature. Our first dialogue is a candid discussion with Rita Zaghloul, the head of the High Ambition Coalition, the largest intergovernmental coalition for nature. Hosting this discussion is Midori Paxton from the United Nations Development Programme. Let's listen as they explore the barriers to forging national plans into dynamic, inclusive blueprints for genuine action.
Invisibility of nature in the decision making.
The clock is ticking. We have less than 5 years now to reach our goal for 2030.
What if the real challenge is elsewhere?
The lack of clarity on what counts as effective conservation, political feasibility and the leadership, the financial constraints, equity and ambition, there's accountability put in place, reaching that balance.
Hi Rita, so good to see you, and thank you so much for joining us for this conversation on ambition on nature.
Thank you so much, Midori. It's a pleasure to see you too. Very excited about our conversation today.
So we both support countries with implementation of the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans, or NBSAPs, and these are essentially the biodiversity plan of countries to drive implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which was agreed by over 190 countries during the CBD COP15 in 2022. But as you know, NBSAPs are often seen as falling short because of implementation gaps. But what if the real challenge is elsewhere and begins much earlier, well before NBSAPs are formulated? What are the less discussed barriers that can limit ambition from the outset? And how are you working to overcome them?
That's an excellent question, Midori, and I'll be mainly focusing on Target 3 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which is the target of protecting at least 30% of our planet's land and ocean by 2030. And I think many times we look a lot into the quantitative manner, not as much into the quality. I think I would divide our the challenges and the barriers in 5 main elements. And I completely agree that it's really in the design stage that we often overlook, as we're really eager to progress with this target specifically, and the clock is ticking. We know that we have less than 5 years now to reach our goal for 2030. Now it's 4 years and 11 months that we have, and so we tend to really focus on that number. But I will focus more on the 5 main elements from the design stage that I think is also quite key. The first barrier, I would say, it's really focusing on the lack of clarity on what counts as effective conservation, because we don't want to have more areas that are designated as protected areas, but there are paper parks. So ensuring that those areas have clear standards for ecological integrity, connectivity, equity, and ambition really gets diluted before the implementation even begins. We need to make sure that we have the correct data in order to be able to make those decisions. The second one, I would say, is more on the political feasibility and the leadership. I think many times in the early draft, we often reflect on what's politically quote unquote safe, rather on what's ecologically necessary and what is needed, mainly focusing on economic interest that more than often dominates our conversation. The third component, I would say, is the financial constraints. And I think, as you know, many of the developing countries and small island states struggle with this. In many cases, there is a lot of political leadership and a lot of willingness, but there's the financial gap is really a reality, and this is something that needs to be taken into consideration and is really a barrier for the implementation. The fourth one is really on the governance, the capacity, and the equity element. Many countries lack institutional capacity to design, manage, and monitor protected areas effectively. And of course, we need to make sure that indigenous peoples and local communities are really meaningfully included from the outset. And I think that's another element that I think slows down at the beginning, but also is quite key to make sure that we reach our goal. And the fifth and last one, I think this is more of on once we have those designs put in place, how we monitor and we account. There's accountability put in place to make sure that really we can track the progress and we can ensure compliance on those targets.
And I'd like to pick up on the political dimension. You talked about political feasibility and leadership. How do you deal with, in your work, like turnovers of ministers and presidents and other key champions you might have met? And any inspiring examples you can give of strong, sustained political leadership in any country?
That's actually like our bread and butter of every day. So the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People, it's a coalition of 122 countries. And as you know, at the very beginning of the creation of the coalition, it was mainly a diplomatic effort to make sure that the 30 by 30 was adopted. It was adopted in 2022. So we had 8 years. We have 8 years to implement the target. And in 8 years, there's a lot of turnover in the different and changing governments, changing priorities, ensuring that the incoming governments and the incoming officials know and understand about the target, why it's important, why the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is so important, and kind of explaining and re-explaining and ensuring that there is continuity. I think that's one of the key challenges, but also one of the key opportunities that we have. We have identified some key champions that have really been on the front line. But I think it also has to be accompanied by the technical support as well, because in many cases, the technical teams are maintained throughout all the different years from now until 2030, hopefully. And so that's already one step one in the fact that we have the technical expertise and the technical kind of buy-in on the importance of this of these target and of the framework as a whole. The other element I think that is quite important is making sure that the new and incoming ministers and heads of state and heads of government understand the importance of this target and of the framework as a whole. So engaging regularly between the different countries, that's quite key. within the coalition, we identified an array of different champions from different regions. And so whenever there's an incoming a new minister, we intend to make sure that they know, they understand, and they have exchanges with different countries and different regions. What we have learned in the last few years is that it's not only important to engage, it's important to re-engage and to open the spaces for those conversations and exchanges to take place between amongst peer-to-peer and creating that space.
You also talked about financial barriers, right? And which is also linked to this invisibility of nature, I would say, in the decision making. And but we also know that there is not enough money around the world, right? But where money goes and how money is spent is an issue. And from our side, also through biofin support for 132 countries and support for TNFD and so on, we are trying to address that, this redirecting finance flows from nature negative towards nature positive. Would you like to elaborate a little more on this finance barrier you mentioned as part of the 5?
Absolutely. And I think that's a key barrier, especially for our developing countries, small island state and least developed countries. And I think, as you correctly say, it's not that there's not enough. I mean, of course, we always need more financing, but there has been an increase in the financing for biodiversity since 2019. We have seen a positive increase into finance for biodiversity. But there's also, I think, an element that is often overlooked is the harmful subsidies. And how can we also tackle this element? Because it's not only about bringing more financial flows into biodiversity, but also how can we arrest all the harmful subsidies that actually take all our efforts back, right? And I think in that sense, there has been a lot of different financial mechanisms that have been created, and part of that is bringing that knowledge to the countries and to the technical teams, because what we hear also is that there's a lot of complexities in accessing the funding, and so how can we facilitate that and provide the tools and the capacities for the countries to be able to access those different mechanisms. This is also the complicated element that we have, is that we need to move fast, but moving fast can't hinder the moving effectively and understanding fully what are the different options that countries have in that sense. So yeah, I think it's reaching that balance that is quite key.
Great, and thank you for highlighting this negative finance with example of subsidies. So helps the country and financiers and government if the money is better used for something nature positive and people positive as well. So
Exactly.
when I think about high ambition coalition for nature and people, I think of more like, political level, high level, galvanizing the political will and coalition and movements and so on. But you also mentioned, people, local people, indigenous people, the important role they play. So how, from your perspective, in your work, you tackle this particular barrier you mentioned?
When the coalition was created from the beginning, we really realized that it was needed to make sure that indigenous people and local communities were included in our conversations from the outset, even before really discussing and negotiating the target itself. And so that's why in 2020, we created the Task Force on Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities. And we created a partnership and a collaboration with the International Indigenous Forum for Biodiversity to make sure that, we had this open channel between government officials and between indigenous people and local communities representatives from the outset to have this conversation and make sure that when the target was adopted, it was sufficiently robust and strong for the implementation. Once this happened, we now moved into the implementation phase, and this collaboration and conversation continues. And so we've been continuing on activating this task force to ensure that the dialogue is really fluent and goes back and forth with our main, I would say, partner, which is the IIFB, because I think that it opened really the conversation between the country members and the IIFB representatives. So every time we engage with ministers and we create those international meetings or international events, we make sure that there's also the voice of indigenous peoples and local communities, that it's also active and really present in those discussions. And then from there, also going into the implementation itself, we have a lot of our country members that really are ensuring and that are really striving for the inclusion of indigenous peoples and local communities at the outset, to have them as central part of the implementation of 30 by 30. So I think it's been really across the board that we've been trying to go through all this multi-layered, I would say, both from a technical perspective, political perspective, and from the implementation side as well. Of course, there's a lot to do still, and we need to make sure that this continues and strengthens.
To have such mechanism from the beginning is key, not as an afterthought, right? And if you look at achieving 30 by 30, obviously their role is so critical, because lots of that has to be more community-based conservation areas and indigenous people's conservation areas. So Rita, thank you so much for this inspiring conversation and for your commitment and amazing work for nature and for people.
Thank you so much, Midori.
From policy, we turn to conservation practice. And here we're presented with a profound contradiction. The global map of protected and conserved areas has never been more expansive, yet the pace of biodiversity loss continues to accelerate. This forces us to ask difficult questions, not just about the quantity of our protected areas, but their quality, their connectivity, and their effectiveness. To explore this, our next dialogue is with Andrew Rhodes, Deputy Chair for the World Commission of Protected Areas of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. The host of this discussion is Jameson Irvin, the manager of the Global Programme on Nature for Development at the United Nations Development Programme. Let's listen as they explore the current state of our global protected area system and identify the most powerful economic or political forces that stand in the way of making them truly effective and equitable.
Nature is becoming invisible.
We need to think of nature in a different way.
They see protected areas as an expense and not as an investment. Protected areas are a matter of national security. And we need to break this sort of dichotomy between conservation and development.
We've got another big chunk to go before 2030.
And we've come a long way.
Thank you so much for joining us. Andrew, I was hoping we could talk about the state of protected areas globally. Could you give us a snapshot of what's happening around the world related to protected areas and other kinds of conserved areas?
Well, according to the latest data of UNEP WCMC, Jamie, there was approximately 17.5 of the world terrestrial and inland waters covered by protected and conserved areas, and about 8.5 of the marine realm. That's what we're talking about, over 300,000 protected areas across more than 240 countries. This clearly demonstrates a big advance in area-based metrics, which is moving in a positive direction. Now, the challenges are around quality, effectiveness, connectivity, and equity.
Wonderful. Before we jump into some of the challenges, I want to take a moment to reflect here. And I think that both you and I remember before 2010, when the goal was to have 10% of the world's terrestrial areas under some kind of protection. And I don't even think we met that. But now here we are, we're at 17+%. And the new goal is 30%. And I wonder if you might just take a moment to reflect on this journey the world has been on in such a very short period of time.
Yeah, remember that the Aichi targets, the famous target 11, In Mexico, that was a huge thing. And at that time, we talked about 10 and 17%. 10% marine and 17 terrestrial. And the planet did tremendous strides to move forward in this target. As I mentioned before, let's say we accomplished the terrestrial part of it, 17.5%. We're still under the targets of the 10% marine. We're just at 8.5. It was a tremendous effort in terms of in trying to accelerate the work of decreeing, establishing protected areas, Jamie, and that had an effect in the institutions and the agencies. And now the challenge is 30%, and we're 4 years to 2030. We're still less than halfway through to it. And there's a lot of energy that needs to get into this process.
It's striking when you think that the world's marine protected area estate was only in the single digits of 1, maybe 2% for the longest time. And now suddenly here we are on the cusp of achieving that 10% marine target. In your mind, what's the single most powerful economic or political force that's standing in the way of achieving a more ambitious goal of 30%?
Well, first of all, and this is something that we've been discussing a lot in Mexico, Jamie, protected areas, nature by itself, it's without any doubt a fundamental asset for all countries. It's probably the most important asset countries have. And we need to break this sort of dichotomy between conservation and development. There's still this, unfortunately, misunderstanding that development cannot go together hand in hand with conservation. So this idea of short-term economic development and extractive pressures on nature assets, especially driven by use conversion like resource extraction, agriculture, infrastructure, that competes directly with conservation priorities. It's fundamental that we recognize nature as an asset, the most important asset, especially now in this sort of planetary crisis that we're living. So that is something that governments, ministers of finance, heads of state should incorporate as a sort of a priority. I've always stated in Mexico that nature conservation, protected areas, are a matter of national security. And we should invest in our national security.
Let's dive a little deeper, Andrew. You said we need to recognize nature as an asset, and yet many of the world's countries don't do that. We need to think of nature in a different way, as an engine for economic development, for social development, for justice, but also for, as you say, national security. Say a few more words about that. What needs to happen for countries to put conservation of nature at the forefront of development?
Definitely, there's a need to recognize the value of nature, not necessarily an only financial, economic value of nature, but all value as value itself. We're talking about spiritual value. We're talking about cultural value. We're talking about value in terms of risk, for instance, against extreme weather events. We need to talk about medicines. We need to talk about value in a very comprehensive way. I remember some time ago a conversation with the Ministry of Finance, Jamie, when we tried to increase the budget of protected areas in Mexico. And protected areas and conserved areas are seen as an expense. And during that conversation, we constantly went to the fundamental element of seeing nature and seeing protected areas, obviously as a sort of tool, to protect nature, as the biggest investment that the country should do. I think we're standing in that sort of tipping point, Jamie, towards 2030. To really accomplish the target of 30 by 30, we need to recognize nature, protected areas, conserved areas as an asset and as a fundamental element for global security.
Wow. So, Andrew, what's the best way to actually do that? How do we position nature as an asset, as a long-term asset, as the driver of truly sustainable development, as a solution for climate change mitigation and adaptation, for food security and for water security? Could you describe the world that we want to see in 2030?
We're unfortunately looking at generations that are a short-term, immediate response. We need to probably slow down a little bit and recognize nature as a sort of fundamental element of quality of life, and again, a long-term perspective. We need to slow down things, JB. Not only in terms of economic vision and activities, but slow down in terms of quality of life. I sometimes believe, Jamie, that nature is becoming invisible, and it's becoming just an element of our surroundings. So we need to make nature visible again in our daily lives.
Do you have any bright spots that you can think of where countries or communities are making nature visible, and where they're making the value of nature visible? Can you think of any examples where you can say, yeah, this is it?
I think there's a lot of very good examples of how we are making nature visible again. And probably let me take you to a small community in Bahia de la Paz, in Baja California. A local fishing community, unfortunately, over-harvested mussels and oysters in their bay, which was what the principal, let's say, economic driver of that community. And they took the first fishing permit for restoring oysters in that bay. And for over 10 years or so, they've been focused in restoring the bay and restoring the fisheries. And they are coming back as a very productive community, showcasing that nature and restoring nature is an economic important driver for them.
Well, thinking of some of the challenges that we're facing in meeting the target of 30% protection of the planet, you said we're at 17.5% for terrestrial. We've got another big chunk to go before 2030. Clearly, the role of Indigenous peoples and local communities fall into a separate category, not quite protected area, but what are called other effective conservation measures, or OECMs. What's the role of these kinds of areas? And how do we, as a global community, support Indigenous peoples and local communities in getting legal tenure and helping them ensure these areas increase and flourish?
Through WCPA, the World Commission on Protected Areas, and all the guidance that it has developed, we emphasized, again, that coverage alone is not sufficient. There are key dimensions on design, management effectiveness, connectivity, governance, and equity. Less than 5% of terrestrial protected areas coverage globally has undergone a management effectiveness assessment. And obviously, you can imagine that for marine realm, that figure is even lower. And in terms of connectivity, only about 8.5% of land is both protected and connected globally. So we're still far away from home in terms of 30%. And on representation, for instance, 2/3 of globally identified key biodiversity areas have some kind of protection, but about 1/3 of key BAs lack any protection at all. And on this topic, which is related to Indigenous people and local communities, on governance equity, governance assessments exist only for 0.2% of coverage and less than 0.01% of marine coverage. So we are still in an urgent need to advance on governance equity. But there's hope. So probably the best examples of well-managed protected areas in Mexico come from local communities and indigenous people. And in Mexico, we've got another category, which is a federally recognized category, which is a voluntary scheme on which local communities, indigenous people, private sector, government can voluntarily designate an area for conservation. And that sort of scheme, it's growing significantly in Mexico. There's clearly a trend of locally, either indigenous, local communities, private sector, contributing to this target of 30 by 30. So
Wow.
we'll see that trend coming up in the next years.
Wonderful. Anything else you'd like to add? Anything that we missed?
We've come a long way. And there's a lot of lessons learned. Now we must scale up implementation. No? We must invest in quality and equity. No, we must align protected areas with national ambitions. No, we need to harmonize national ambitions with this element of nature's value. No, obviously for a nature positive development. That we've learned the lessons, we know the best practices, and I'm quite sure that together we'll do it.
The UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration has sparked tremendous ambition, with bold goals set for our forests, farmlands, and coastlines. But ambition can mask complexity. The gap between setting a restoration target and achieving a resilient, functioning ecosystem is vast. It requires moving beyond simple metrics to engage with difficult social, political, and ecological realities. To discuss the realities of this work, our final dialogue today is with Jamal Anagilova, the Ecosystem Restoration Lead at the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Hosting this conversation is Pema Kogomotso, UNDP's expert on land management and restoration. They'll be moving beyond technical metrics to discuss the most significant social and political factors that determine whether large-scale restoration plans ultimately succeed or fail in the long term.
One of the most significant factors that affect restoration,
this cascading effect on the restoration finance.
the issue of rights of access and rights of ownership and control by communities.
But the task would be how to bring those governance and equity issue into the operation.
The data is not always documented.
Next year, it will be pivotal in terms of the lessons learned.
Good evening, afternoon, morning. The last time we saw each other, we were in a workshop discussing land degradation neutrality targets. And as someone who's like working in the area of supporting implementation of multilateral environmental agreements, these targets are important to the bigger restoration conversation that is currently going on among member states of the UN and parties to the CCD and CBD and FCCC conventions, and the implementation of those multilateral environmental agreements with the support of agencies like ourselves and UNDP, who are supporting design of projects and initiatives for financing by the likes of the GEF, Adaptation Fund, GCF, and other similar types of support. So this conversation about restoration has really picked up momentum in the last few years, especially with the declaration of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And many different types of stakeholders are contributing to the action on restoration. And I think restoration means a lot of things to many different people. In fact, this is one of the conversations we're having a lot internally in UNDP. What is restoration? What do you seek to achieve through restoration? But I wanted to chat to you about some elements and factors of restoration that perhaps get left out of the conversation and maybe potentially get ignored, relating in particular to the social elements of it. What do you think are some of the most significant, maybe often ignored social and sometimes even political factors that could ultimately affect restoration and can determine whether the restoration intervention or initiative succeeds or not?
So
It's really good to hear about that, the fact that restoration becomes a central many development projects, and that gives us a lot of optimism. But by this, during the 5 years that are left to achieve the Sustainable Development Agenda, we will really see the results of restoration. On ecosystem restoration, I think there are several factors, and we can even policy or political factors. I would say it's really the macro level what is important for the restoration. We see that very often the political, how stable the political system in the countries. We see the political regimes moving, just flipping over the night from negative to positive towards the environmental agenda, but also vice versa. And that changes the political agenda within the country. But if a country is really in a big economy, if we're talking about the countries, ODA countries, then it's also having this cascading effect on the restoration finance available for the beneficiaries countries. And we already see some reports coming out that there are restoration projects that are being suspended or the activities being reduced due to the lack or the interruption in the financial flows for the restoration. So that has a big effect. And this is something what we're documenting in the project preparation phase as a risk and assumption. And unfortunately, those risk and assumption becomes now materializing in some instances. What is also important, and this is also being considered now in the CBD and the Convention on Biological Diversity more and more, is the governance and equity issues for the restoration. So really seeing the governance as when the planning happens at the scale, and it's inclusive, and especially for the large scale restoration programs, this is very important. And the equity, to the extent of how inclusive the planning for the ecosystem restoration was designed, how much the indigenous people and local communities, their traditional territories, but also their traditional knowledge were considered in all phases of the preparation, implementation, and then of the ecosystem restoration projects is very important. And as you may know, just a few weeks ago, the CBD had this first meeting of the subsidiary body on the Article 8J and other provisions. And that meeting was negotiating the voluntary guideline, how to strengthen the legal and the policy framework for recognizing the role of indigenous peoples and local communities in ecosystem restoration, spatial planning, and the area-based conservations. Once it's finalized, we will have the first guideline, voluntary guideline on this. And then I think for us, really the task would be how to bring those governance and equity issue into the operation. So into the technical guidelines. So this is really an important factor. I would say that another important factor is the economic conditions, and these if you look globally in terms of the restoration pledges, we see that most of the restoration pledges and commitments in terms of relative or in absolute numbers, they're from the global south. And at the same time, the global south are the countries that are still producing a lot they rely on exporting their goods. That's how the economy is based. So, and at the same time, so now those countries are in this conflicting situation when the restoration responsibilities and still production and exporting and in this way sustaining the economy and local livelihoods is become important. We wouldn't say that it's contradictory, but it's still sometimes in the conflict, And we see that the tension is quite high when it comes to implementing the regulation that try to reduce the lung conversion, but still not putting the barriers for the international trade. So I think that factor is really is something that is not commonly discussed when we're planning the restoration, especially big scale restoration projects.
Yeah, and I think this point also speaks a little bit to the issue of rights of access and rights of ownership and control by communities. Let's say in a forest landscape where the forest sector might be very important for the economy, whether it's producing cacao or coffee or whatever it is. When we come into this situation where there is a bit of tension between economic importance and priority of a sector that is based on that ecosystem or landscape, and the issues of community livelihoods and access and rights, it's a very challenging thing actually when we develop programs and initiatives in this social and environmental safeguards element is not really strong, especially where indigenous people are involved, and in some cases there is even sort of lack of recognition of those indigenous people and their rights and their historic use of the ecosystem. So that tension becomes very, very important and can be a major determinant, as you say, of whether an initiative is going to work or not, even if on paper it might look good.
Yes. So for this topic, when we were discussing the voluntary guideline, in fact, the new subsidiary body has chosen this as was agreed that it will be the first task that the subsidiary body will take to consider before it moves on with the rest of its new work program. For CBDs or conventional biological diversity, as you know, we're now in the reporting cycle. So it's the 7th national reporting cycle. And in fact, we're really looking forward to the national reports that will be submitted. And next year, the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration will be also reporting on its 5 years work plan. And we really hope that the next year will be for the ecosystem restoration community will be, I would say, pivotal in terms of the knowledge and the experiences and the lessons learned, what we can achieve.
I do wonder if there's a little question in there for the 7th reports, whether, to ask member states to sort of highlight some of the challenges they're having, because I think often, as you said before, member states tend to shy away from reporting some of the negative things or things that don't go well. And certainly the case with a lot of restoration cases, the failure is not always documented, but it would be good to glean from those reports from member states, because that voice of member states is particularly important in highlighting, what didn't go right.
Yes, indeed. We hope that we will be able to see this information coming in the national reports. But at the same time, the global review will also pull together the information from other MEAs in international organizations. So in this way, we hope that we'll be able to see the synergies across the Rio Convention, and because the ecosystem restoration is really cross-cutting in the Rio Convention and other biodiversity-related conventions. And so we also would be able to see how much we are duplicating, complementing each other, and so what could be done in these next 5 years for us that we can really do better jointly, and really achieving everybody's goals.
Yes, absolutely.
Today, we navigated the complex terrain between policy and practice, from the design of national plans to the realities of conservation and restoration on the ground. And a central theme has emerged from these conversations: that our greatest challenges are often not technical, but are instead political. If these discussions have sparked further questions, I invite you to explore the interactive learning journeys on the Nature for Life Hub platform, where you can delve deeper into these policy and practice solutions at your own pace. This brings us to our final day. Having discussed finance, policy, and practice challenges, our inquiry tomorrow culminates in what is perhaps the most fundamental transformation of all: the value shift. We will move beyond systems and strategies to examine the very heart of our relationship with the natural world, exploring how it shapes our food, our health, our security, and our identity. It is the final, essential piece of our puzzle. I hope you will join us.